I'll admit I've made some pretty bold claims lately about not only Missouri football, but the Alabama Crimson Tide as well. Let's get the national perspective from the Scoutmaster and find out if I'm onto something or completely insane. You decide for yourself, coming up right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso, and a man who always challenges his own assumptions, and that's what I'm going to be doing a lot on today's program when I talk to Brian Smith, who is the head recruiting analyst for us over at the Locked On Podcast Network. But I'm going to talk a lot of big picture stuff with Brian coming up on the program here too, including what I've said about Missouri's toughest opponent on paper, the Crimson Tide. What's going on with Alabama and all the transition that they're going through right now. LSU, Blake Baker's new home comes up as well. Plus we get to Matt Zollers, his fast rise, Jack Lange talk as well. And I put Brian on the spot to ask him if Missouri's going to make the playoff this year. So let's get to it without any further ado right now. All right, joining me once again is the Scout Master here at the Locked On Podcast Network. And of course, boys and girls are always welcome here on the show. But anytime we have Brian on the program, we got to give a little love to LinkedIn, where these days every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. The terms and conditions apply. And, you know, Brian, we usually talk high school, and we certainly will in this segment here, but I want to start off on the actual college football field. I know you've made a lot of trips down to Auburn, Alabama this spring. I've had some not-so-kind predictions for the Auburn Tigers this year. Maybe Missouri's fourth best opponent on paper. What are you thinking about Auburn for this season?
If you'd have asked me 6 weeks ago, it would be much different than now. Auburn had major deficiencies at defensive tackle. Just not enough depth. They didn't have a playmaker. They lost their best guy to the NFL. And as you know, this is a lineman league. If you do not have depth at defensive tackle and experienced depth, guys that have been through all the strength and conditioning programs for multiple years, back half of your schedule is probably not going to go well, meaning the SEC slate. They went out and added 2 D tackles and a pass rusher. So they went out and spent the NIL money to get what they needed. So I went from saying they're a 6-6 team to possibly an 8-4 team because they just completely changed how they were up front. And they also added another good receiver, the kid from Penn State, Keandre Lambert-Smith. So I think they're better now. I would still think Missouri's considerably better than what Auburn is, and they should win that game, but it'll at least be competitive now. So at one point, if you'd have said, what do you think score? I'd say something like 31-14 or something. That would have been my pick. But now a 10-point game it'd be competitive.
Okay, well, that's about where FanDuel Sportsbook has is about 10 points. Last time I checked, I don't have that number in front of me, but that sounds like you're on about the right wavelength with them. So maybe should be a win for Missouri against Auburn. You never know what can happen in a few months, obviously. But you know what? Let's stick inside the state for a second. I just noticed that Alabama, of course, Nick Saban retired, new coach, and also just a ton of transition in that roster. They've had, I believe, 39 portal exits, and they've maybe brought in 15 or 20 guys, but it just seems like, boy, that's going to be a real roster transition, a real coaching transition, and I could be wrong, but that seems like that could be a real young roster at first glance. What do you think's going on down in Alabama? What should we expect from the Tide this season?
Well, I don't know what exactly is, but I don't get warm and fuzzies. I know that Kalen DeBoer's a very good football coach. I'm not arguing that. But there's a difference between being a good football coach and being a good football coach in the SEC if you're not a Southerner. I'm just being honest. Yes, it matters if you're from the South down here. It does. They don't do well with outsiders that well, and he's a West Coast guy. It's just true. I need to see it. And they had so many guys leave. I don't understand why, because they're still going to play. It's still Alabama. They have all the money in the facility. Everything's still there. He's a proven coach. Why would you have that many? Like, I have pause. And I'm not saying I'm predicting them to go 6-6 or something. I'm not an idiot.
Sure.
But like, their quarterback play is iffy. What they have, 116 yards passing against Michigan. I mean, they got some problems. And they lost their best receiver to Texas. They have a lot of defensive deficiencies. Like, their secondary was gutted. I don't think they're going to be above 9-3. And I know that college football is going to be a hodgepodge this year. There's a lot of 9-3-ish teams, but they just have too much turnover mixed with you got to put in your systems. There's no friendly with first year. I don't care how good a coach you are. There are going to be a couple games where things go haywire. History of college football has proven that. So I think Alabama is going to be the team. If you're a gambler, do yourself a favor. Take Alabama off your board this year completely, because it'll be week to week what they do, because roster's too much turnover and a new coach. The culture is going to be different. I'm really curious about them, because I don't know how you could possibly project anything beyond just like an overall record. Week to week, it'll be really hard.
We know, since you brought up maybe a northerner coming down south to be a coach in the SEC, I agree with you, and I think somebody who kind of showed he agreed with you, especially early in his tenure, was Brian Kelly at LSU. He sort of famously was, and humorously was, trying to adopt a Southern accent.
That isn't going to work down there.
Well, here's the thing with LSU. They're kind of in a similar spot to Alabama in that they've had a lot of portal exits as well, but theirs isn't related to a new coach, and of course, a lot of different guys going off to the NFL too. Again, Missouri isn't going to play LSU this season unless, they happen to meet in the SEC title game. But again, a big-time program here. I'm just curious more from just a big-picture college football perspective. It's just odd to see LSU, again, under a lot of transition. Do you think maybe LSU and Bama are going to be relying on their high school recruiting more than other programs right now?
This is an interesting subject, and one I'm starting to put a checkbox on my spreadsheets. Long term, it'll work. Short term, and of course, we know fan is short for fanatic. Patience and fanatic have nothing in common. What Kelly's doing, and I'm sure you're kind of alluding to his comments about defensive tackle recruiting here recently. If you want to look it up, it was a disaster. Like he said, we're not in the business of buying players, and LSU's in a really bad spot at defensive tackle, but they're just trying to do high school kids pretty much. And their high school recruiting is good, but like they've got a bunch of roster holes and stuff, and they didn't go out and get guys. There could be a really underwhelming team compared to what they should be, because their offense is going to be elite again. But defensively, they're a sieve. So they're one of the teams that's doing that. And I don't think it's going to work short term. And LSU fans have zero patience. I know from living in that state before. I don't know how that's going to work for them, because he may not be around, because LSU fans will not wait. While other teams, they just will not. They will flip their lid over it. So I think they're going to be 8-4 this year, which at LSU, to them, that's like 0-12. Their fan base is crazy. I don't know if you can get away with that at that program. Missouri's done it, and it's worked. And then now they've added a few guys. They've done it traditionally, but they're on the back end of that. Missouri doesn't have the same cachet that LSU does historically with their fan base. You can do it that way, and I think LSU staff can get there if their fan base allows it. But man, the culture thing, I understand, but can you get there's other pitfalls there along the way, and that starts with the fan base and the boosters not writing checks. So be careful for what you wish for.
Yeah, and I think they're on the lowest end of the SEC in terms of just players added in the portal, so, or like 6-7 guys or something like that. So, I mean, if that's what Brian Kelly was talking about, I guess he has a point there. But to sort of bring it back to Missouri a little bit, the reason I'm glad you laid all that LSU track out there is because, of course, LSU poached Missouri's defensive coordinator this past offseason, Blake Baker. And I got a lot of LSU fans ire by saying, I thought that was kind of a lateral move, because despite the fact that, sure, LSU has more cachet than Missouri, no question about that, to me, that's not a very stable position right now for the reasons you laid out there. At least from outside looking in, maybe people think, what are you talking about? LSU was pretty good last year. Things have gone okay for Brian Kelly. I'm just telling you, that 2019 team was not that long ago, one of the great teams of all time. They have really, really high expectations, without a doubt. And speaking of high expectations, more of my discussion with Brian Smith. I want to ask him about Matt Zollers, hopefully Missouri's quarterback of the future, and what's up with his seemingly rise through the rankings each and every week here in terms of high school rankings. So I want to talk about that. But first, let's talk about eBay Motors, because passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With more than 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. And you know what? Speaking of high expectations, let's transfer to the high school ranks here for a little bit. Matt Zollers, a guy, quarterback out of the state of Pennsylvania, 4-star guy. He's maybe on the verge of becoming a 5-star some places. I've seen him as the second overall player at On3, the second overall quarterback, top 20 overall. Now Rivals, who was bringing up the rear on their rankings with him, they're saying, hey, we're going to give him a big rankings boost. What do you think is behind Matt Zollers and his continuous rise up the rankings seemingly everywhere throughout the landscape here?
He's not a Southern kid, so like where we live, everybody pretty much lives Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and some Texas guys. If you're not a recruit that's kind of in that proximity, you'll get seen later. And what I mean by that, it's your huddle film's great. They want to see you live. Your ranking will go up if you live in that footprint. It's just the way it is.
Yep.
There's no fixing it. There's some California guys too, but there are very few Midwest guys, and he lives in PA. So like, I remember seeing his film last. I'm like, this is pretty good. And, I watched some more and I'm like, he can run, he can do a lot of things. The chances for him to be a really good quarterback are there. Quarterbacks recruiting is really hard to rank, but
yes,
he lives in Pennsylvania. He's not in Atlanta. He's not in Orlando. He's not in New Orleans. He just hasn't had as many eyeballs on him. Now that he's been to like Elite 11 camps and stuff like that, he's been to these Under Armour camps, all that kind of stuff. Everybody's seen him. That's the difference. I know most of the guys that do the rankings, personally, friends of mine, they want to see him live.
Right.
And unless they do, you're very unlikely to be like a top 50 kid. That's bottom line.
That's interesting. I love that behind the scenes stuff. I really do, just to kind of understand how the whole process works. And it makes all the sense in the world. I mean, we're all just human beings with limited capacity. You can only see so much tape, so many people in person. So geography, that kind of stuff, underrated factor, but I mean, it makes a massive difference. And speaking of geography, maybe a guy like Jack Lange, some places would fly under the radar. He's, I believe, Eureka, Missouri, if I'm getting that off the top of my head correctly. So he's not in the South either, and yet, well, he's a guy at his size who's going to turn some heads for sure. What have you heard about Jack Lange, a recent offensive lineman commit for the Tigers?
I think he's one of the top 5 tackles in the class. If you just look at the frame, the footwork, and all that, the knock on him is where he's at. Is he playing elite competition? Probably not, but he's a guy that's really, really talented. And I'm not saying he's going to be Joe Alt, but he's like, you look at the high school situation. Alt was from some random high school in Minnesota. So it can happen. He was just the 5th pick of the draft out of Notre Dame. So there's comparisons like that. But when you watch the film, does he have length? Does he have height? And can he move laterally? The answer is yes on all of those fronts. I just don't see how he's not a guy that ends up being a starter for the Tigers. He could have played at Michigan, Notre Dame, Georgia, whatever he wanted.
Wisconsin was on there. Yeah.
I mean, he has the
places
right
that have churned out a lot of good
That's
offensive
exactly
linemen.
right.
Yeah.
Like if Georgia or Notre Dame wants an offensive lineman, like Wisconsin wants a lineman.
You want him too.
Yeah, that's pretty obvious. Here's the other part with him. When was the last time Missouri signed the top tackle out of the state? A guy that was a national kid.
Sure.
I could be wrong, but if you're going to consistently compete with Georgia, Bama, LSU, they beat most teams in the trenches. Everybody, it's fun to talk about the receivers at these schools. 3rd down and 1, they get the first down. It's because they have guys like Jack. Missouri starts getting those kids, they can compete with anybody. It's the difference between winning and losing at the elite level. It's in the trenches.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say, to your point, I can't recall a ton of guys off the top of my head. There's maybe a couple I can think of, but neither one of them totally made it out of the state of Missouri, and a lot of that was injury related. And I think sometimes guys, when they start putting on that weight, trying to get up to 320, they can't handle it. I think Jack Lange, he's a guy at 6'8", and he's already, 270, 280, but he's got a skinny face, Brian. That tells me he can handle a little bit more weight. Does that make any sense to you?
Absolutely. It's the frame that you can build from, the piece of clay, if you will. Lange is not a guy that's filled out, but he's already really good. So you know that he has upside. He's not done growing. There's nothing wrong with the 6'6", 315 guy out of high school. There's plenty of those that are good too. But Jack's just one of those guys that I think can be a left tackle at the SEC level. Very few of them. Probably needs a redshirt year, but as a second-year player, he could be a starter for the Missouri Tigers. Absolutely.
Yeah, and again, to your point, Missouri, not only have they not gotten a ton of those guys from out of the state the last, say, 10 years or so, I can't think of a ton of them, period. There just aren't a ton of, 4 or 5-star linemen that come out of this state for whatever reason. So to your point there. Now, one other guy who's a big-time get for the Tigers, a linebacker out of the state of Ohio, Dante McClellan. And as Brian said, he's based out of the South. He hasn't seen Dante actually play yet. What I thought was interesting, though, he's got the big picture perspective here. A guy from Canton, Ohio, a highly ranked 4-star, according to Rivals.com anyway, but not an Ohio State offer. Some other impressive offers for McClellan, of course, Missouri being among them. But if Ohio State doesn't offer, what does that tell you?
Ohio State has been really weird with in-state recruiting. I had a conversation with an Ohio State coach recently, about a year or so ago, about this. A lot of the coaches inside the state are not real happy with Ryan Day's staff. They think they're too picky. They think they're overlooking a lot of their kids. But the Ohio State staff thinks they need to get more of the Florida, Georgia kids to beat Georgia, Bama, schools like that.
Sure.
So you're taking a risk, because if you play against that kid one day, he's going to remember that he didn't get an offer from State U. That's part of it. But Ohio State is uber selective of who they offer, and they don't care what state they're from anymore. Used to, when I was growing up, they signed 12 kids a year from Ohio, if not more. Now they'll sign 6 or 8. So it's just a change in philosophy from the Buckeyes. Doesn't mean the players are any different. It's just they're not recruiting them as much. Very odd.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Kind of shows the landscape has changed, I think, everywhere. It's just a little bit easier. As you said, obviously geography matters, but so does the proliferation of technology the last decade as well. A lot more video, a lot more high-quality video is out there and uploaded on the internet and all of that good stuff. So that's a really interesting take. And also just the idea of, hey, there's a lot of political dynamics behind the scenes here too. Recruiting is very much about relationships, so there's a real balance that people like Ryan Day and, of course, Eli Drinkwitz have to make there. And you know what, Brian? Thanks, as always, for your time. I'll get you out of here finally with this one question. I want to put you on the spot. As we sit here today, do you think Missouri will make the 12-team playoff in 2024? I'd love to get the national perspective here, not just a complete homer like myself.
Absolutely. The answer is yes. They've got a really good quarterback who's in the same system. You've got a coach that has everything in play. They finally got enough depth where they can be competitive week to week. I'm not saying they're going 12-0 in the regular season. They do play in the SEC, but I think 10-2 is something they can do. Would they possibly make the SEC title game? I could see that. But even if they got beat in that and go 10-3, they're probably going to lose to Georgia if that's the game they're playing. Which
sure.
I think Georgia's by far the best team for this next fall. Big shocker there. But I think Missouri overall has a really balanced team. And I just don't think that you can discount having, third-year Cook starting? Like, not many teams that are top 10 level overall as a roster have a third-year starter at QB.
Right.
It is so important. There's no shortcut to it. If you look at the stats, any time in the last 15 years for any QB, once they get to about 400 passes, the light comes on. And that's the minimum they have to. It means basically your first season, you're terrible. Like a lot of people were complaining about Cook. Remember coming into last year?
Mm-hmm.
Boy, it changed his second year, didn't it? And there's just no shortcut. Most guys are terrible their first year starting. Now he's a third-year guy. They've got, kind of helps out Luther.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, they got a ton of returning production on offense. Yeah.
So they've got players. I know they lost a good running back, but like they've got other guys that are good. The offensive line's well coached. They're going to be a nightmare to play this year. They'll be in every game. I really think Missouri can be possibly a top 8 team. It just depends, injuries and, a few close games. But I think they should expect to win 10 games.
I love it. Missouri should expect to win 10 games this season. You heard it from the Scout Master himself, Brian Smith, at FBScout_Florida on Twitter, on X.com. Brian, thank you so much as always. Great segment as per usual.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Well, it always feels good when a smart person that you respect pretty much agrees with what you're saying. So thanks to Brian Smith for another great appearance, as always. And coming up to finish out the program, I do want to answer some questions, I should say, from the audience about the potential schedule for Missouri actually backfiring, and also Dennis Gates, how long is his leash with a new AD in tow? So let's talk about that all coming up here on the program. But first, I want to tell you about Gametime, because Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of the NBA, which makes getting playoff tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. And, of course, I know many of you are Major League Baseball fans as well. The Cardinals and the Royals are on the West Coast right now. But when you come through, when the teams come through again, you got to get your tickets through Gametime. They make it so easy to find and buy MLB tickets and every type of other event in your area. The best thing is it's going to be impossible to beat Gametime. They have the lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you with 110% of the difference. Plus, their all-in pricing, just toggling this feature, shows the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. To me, Gametime really is the best way to take guesswork out of buying NBA tickets or Major League Baseball tickets. So download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. And redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So obviously Brian Smith mentioned that as we sit here today, he would have Missouri on the happy side of the 12-team playoff. And Christian Mayberry over on YouTube, one of my listeners, by the way, he was asking this question. I've been premiering these shows live on YouTube lately. So when that happens, I more often than not will be there to answer your questions live during the show. So if you want to check that out, well, you can click on the notifications bell anywhere on my videos, the homepage, that kind of thing, and then you'll get notified on your phone or your device whenever a new show is premiering. So check that out if you want to. But again, Christian on YouTube asks, could the easy schedule work against us? And I think absolutely is the short answer. Long answer is I think 10-2 is where it gets really, really interesting, because if Missouri goes 11-1 in the regular season, no matter who they lose to, they're going to be making the 12-team playoff. Even if Missouri gets blown out in that scenario in the SEC title game, even at 11-2, to me, that's got to be a top 12 team right there. And obviously, any type of an SEC championship is going to get you in as well by rule. Now, how about a runner-up? That was sort of a more interesting scenario to me that Brian actually brought up. What if Missouri goes 10-2, loses in the SEC title game to Georgia, for example? Well, then you're 10-3. That's a little bit more tenuous. but I would still say Missouri would be on the happy side there, being the second best team in the SEC. On the other hand, 9-3. If Missouri goes 9-3, I just don't see a scenario where the Tigers get in. So 11-1, you're good. 9-3, you're out. 10-2, I think it kind of depends on how everything shakes out. More likely than not, more often than not, in terms of all the possible scenarios, I think the Tigers would indeed get in at 10-2 at, say, third or fourth in the SEC. But it's not a sure thing at that point with Missouri's schedule, especially if, say, Alabama is maybe not quite as good as people are expecting. What if Texas A&M isn't quite as good as people are expecting? Oklahoma, etc. Again, there could also be teams that are much better than people are expecting, like Missouri was last season as well. So all of this is just to say, as we sit here today, I think 10-2 gets the Tigers in. 9-3, I'd say no chance, really, quite honestly. Now, when it comes to Dennis Gates, I had Scott Jones during my premiere yesterday ask, how long is the leash on Dennis Gates? And short answer again, I would say probably shorter than it would have been with Desiree Reed-Francois. That's for sure, because, well, obviously, along with the rest of us as fans, let's be real, after that first season with Gates, well, Dennis Gates was the apple of my eye and Desiree Reed-Francois' eye and every Missouri basketball fan's eye that I'm aware of. Quite the dramatic fall last season, as we all remember. So clearly Dennis Gates' job, it is a question. How much job security does he have? Because the year one and year two could not have been more stark in the difference there. What I think is Missouri, number one, I think Missouri will probably be a bubble team next year at the very least. That's my prediction. Could obviously be wrong. Didn't see last season coming, a last place winless campaign coming whatsoever. But in my opinion, there's a couple factors here. I said I had a two-pronged theory yesterday about big guys not coaching in basketball. I have yet another two-pronged theory for you. I just think, obviously, Missouri can't be really, really bad yet again. I mean, 0-19 is almost certainly not going to happen. But if Missouri is, say, 15th or 14th out of 16 teams in the league, that's just about as embarrassing and not a sign of a step forward, that's for sure. But, again, what if Missouri is, say, the 14th team out of 16 in the league, but there's a lot of promise from Peyton Marshall and Honor Boateng and T.O. Barrett, whoever it might be, there is some real promise from that freshman class. So the two things that cannot happen this season, Missouri cannot be really, really bad once again and have the freshman class be underwhelming. Because if those two things happen, what's the case for Dennis Gates coming back for year 4? And if you think 3 years not enough to establish a culture in college basketball these days, well, how many teams are trying to establish a culture, quite honestly? Considering at least 4 guys is the average, 4 or 5 guys every year are coming in and out of every program through the portal. Not only does that hurt your sort of cohesion, but it also speeds up the timeline for coaches fairly or unfairly. So don't get me wrong, if I had to bet money one way or the other, an even money bet, I'm not betting on Dennis Gates going anywhere. I think he'll get a year 4. I would definitely put the odds in favor of that for sure. But again, what I just laid out there, if Missouri has another really disappointing season to go along with a freshman class that was ballyhooed, but then underwhelms next season, doesn't show you as much promise as you'd hope. Yeah, especially with a new AD in Laird Veach, I think anything's possible after next season, again, with those two things happen. So, as always, thank you for joining me here on Locked On Mizzou. Thanks to Brian Smith for taking some time out of his day. Brian Smith, of course, not to be confused with the great wrestling coach, but the scout master, indeed, is our Brian. So thanks, as always, for joining me here on Locked On Mizzou. And until next time, I'm John Miller, and this has been Locked On Mizzou.